Hey everybody, welcome back to the Engineered Angler. Today we're going to go ahead and leave the melting wax behind. I've burned my hands too many times. So we're going to move on to making soft plastic swim bait. Not just one. I want to make multiple soft plastic swim baits so that we can test different tails. And in order to do that, I have to make molds for each one of these test lures. And I don't want to make a bunch of silicone molds that I may never use again. Silicone's expensive. So we're going to make our molds out of something that is quick and easy to use and reusable. But before I get into that material, let's go to the dry erase board and we'll talk a little bit about tails and tail shape. Now the swim bait is going to have a little bit of an unconventional shape because I want it to be perfectly symmetric. The same at the top and at the bottom. I don't want the shape of the body to affect the swimming action. I want only the tail to be the variable. So the first tail we're going to talk about is the tail everybody's used to seeing, which is what people typically call a boot tail. And here's a typical example of that kind of boot tail. You can see it looks like a boot. You'll notice there's a little bit of a gusset right here where the turn is, right there, just like the one I drew. And the more of a gusset there is, the more action you get out of these guys. I know that from experience. And with one with no gusset like this one, as you're pulling it along, it tends to straighten out and give you very little action. It does wiggle with a very small amplitude. The next one we're gonna do is a ball tail. And there are some lures on the market that have a little ball tail on them. Usually they're used as twitching lures, but I think they actually do produce a little bit of a tail waggle, and I just want to see what it does. And along those lines, I want to do a half a ball and see if having this blunt at the end creates more turbulence and maybe more movement. And I also want to do a modified version of that, which will be what I think people call a lug tail. Something like that. It'll have sort of the profile of a normal tail, but when you look down on it, it'll be sort of a blunt shape that sort of tapers to the top and to the bottom. We'll see how that works. And I also want to make a natural fish tail, maybe not quite that big, that tapers down to a very flat and thin tail to see if maybe that produces any sort of natural movement. But the first step is going to be shaping the main body, and we'll do that on the lathe. I've got a piece of old cypress window trim on here. I've had it laying around my shop for like 15 years, but I don't have a dowel, and that's really the perfect thing to start off with on this. If I had a 1-inch dowel, that's what I'd be using. So I'm gonna go ahead and get this turned down to a nice round profile here, and then I'll shape the head over on this side, have that thin tail, and I'm gonna try to make the ball directly on here. We'll see how successful I am with that. All right, so I've got kind of the general shape roughed in. I've got this sort of arrowhead sort of shape for the head and the tail shank area, and I've got the beginning of that tail ball. Now I'm gonna leave thinning this out for very last so I don't blow this thing up, but I'm gonna go ahead and continue to fare this down just a little bit. It's still a little bit big, and I want it to come down to a more abrupt nose here. All right, let me go ahead and separate it from the stock. We'll move on. All right, it's the next day. I got busy and I did do a few things off camera just to move this project along because there's a lot to do. So I took our master and I put a thin clear coat on there. Not so much for the glossy finish, but mostly to sort of fill all the pores so it wouldn't absorb any of the oil from the sand we're going to use to make the molds. Now the sand I'm talking about is this stuff. It's actually foundry sand. This is the kind of sand folks use to make molds so they can cast things out of molten metal. Aluminum, brass, bronze, copper, I think copper, and even cast iron. I've seen them use it. A couple of 2-pound bags, and when I've done this before, I've used this mold box, and it's a little big for this project, but we're gonna make do. I've also glued a sprue on there, and that's gonna act as a little bit of a reservoir and a way of funneling the molten plastic into the mold and into the cavity that this thing's going to form in the sand. So the first thing we're going to do is put in our base bed of sand. Now people call this Petrobond sand because it actually has oils in it that bond it together. So when you compress it, it actually creates a little bit of a solid. Of course, it's still pretty delicate, so you can't be too abusive with this. And really, it's almost impossible to use the mold twice on the same thing. And the idea is to start compressing this stuff. And you can do this with your fingers, but I kind of like getting in here with a flat object to get it going. And you can be pretty aggressive and push pretty hard. The idea is to get this thing to really bond together. Now I've laid in like a solid base, and of course this still has to go in, so I'm going to put in a fluffy base on top of this that I can embed my lure into. And this stuff is really fine. It feels almost like a oily powder, and the finer the grain you get, the finer of course the finished product is going to look like. And I want to be able to set this in here so that X center spot that I put on there is centered on the hole in my mold box. And the process can be a little bit tedious, I'm not going to kid you, but it's no more finicky than doing a mold box with a clay bed. And the key here is to take your time getting everything really well compacted and trying to get a seam line that's along the center of the lure. This first part of the mold is really the hard part, the open side where you're having to really tweak around all the little bends and curves of your lure. Alright, I'm pretty happy with that. At this point I have to put a light coating of this talcum powder so the next layer of clay doesn't stick to this layer. And with that done, we can just put the top half on. There you go. And if you look, you can see there's a stripe of tape in there. And that's just to tell me how high to come up with the sand, so I don't overdo it. And this is the easy part. We just stack it in there, spread it out, and start tamping it in. Alright, it's nicely compacted, and we can probably pull this thing apart pretty easily now. There you go. And the sand stays in the top, and we get a pretty nice impression of our master in there. Hopefully we can get the master out without doing too much damage. This is where having the seam line right in the middle is really important, because if it's slightly above and starts going around the lure a little bit, really tough to get the master out without doing damage. I may be predicting the damage myself here. So I drilled a little hole right where the eye is so I can set this screw in there and use that as a handle to pull this thing out. Oh. Now, I obviously damaged it. Now, the nice thing is that I can compact this back in, back to the line that I had on there. And we already have the other one, so we should be able to salvage this. All right, I'm doing a couple of colors. The yellow is gonna be for the tail, so we have a nice bright color to see underwater, see how it's moving. And then a darker color for the main body. And I've got the extractor fan going, so a lot of background noise. All right, let's pour the tail. Should be enough, and then we'll pour the main body. Alright, that's going to take a little while. Now, the sand is a pretty good heat sink. It will draw the heat out pretty quickly, but with the oil in it and the wood around it, it's probably going to take a little longer than I think. And while we're waiting for that to cool off, I'm just going to go ahead and just sketch out the next tail, which is going to be the boot tail. And I'm making it out of a piece of plexiglass. So it's just a matter of cutting off the big stuff and then shaping the rest with the disc sander. All right, I'm a little bit impatient to wait anymore. I hope it's hard enough to pull out of there. I'm a little concerned that we might have to redo this one because I didn't do a very good job on that, on getting this thing nicely centered in the mold. So let's see how this opens. That is not bad at all. Of course, it looks like it's coated in this sand, and it is. So we'll have to see how well it cleans up. Let's wash off the sand, and there's our results. That ball is really swinging around. There is a little bit of a divot in the ball. I don't know if it's apparent right there, but that's from shrinkage and not from needing a vent or anything. So I just got to clean off some of the flash, which I was expecting, and we'll live with that. It's a good experimental base, and we'll move on to the next tail, which is going to be half a ball. All right, I've drawn a little line right where I want to cut this thing, right at half a ball. And to get started on the next casting, I gotta get all this clay out of the blind side of the mold. And then just scoop out enough of the clay so I can get the next master in there. And we go through the same process of building up the clay and getting a nice tight edge around the master. Putting the talc back on, cleaning it up a little bit. And then we can start filling the blind side and getting that all packed in tight so we can separate it and pour. And we'll start off with the yellow just like last time. Try to put a little less this time. And then the main body color. And I like to really stack it on top. I know it looks like a mess, but it creates a little more for this thing to draw from as it's cooling off, because it definitely suffers from shrinkage. And after about 20 minutes cooling, it's ready to demold. And it looks pretty good, a little bit of flash, but it'll clean up pretty nice. The next tail is going to be the boot tail, so I got to modify this half ball so it just forms a platform to mount it on, and I've got to take the top off so I just have the gusset on the bottom. This will make a nice place to mount it. It should look pretty good once I got it all sanded down. And I'll rough up the surface a little bit with some sandpaper so that the glue has something to really bind to. And UV epoxy is the perfect glue for this, since it sets up pretty quickly and the UV light will go straight through the select sand. And I'll set it up on the light to let that set for a minute or two. Well, it's been like this for 10 days. Dreary, rainy, and just impossible to do anything outside. So it's very unlikely with a hurricane in the Gulf that we're going to get to test these things in the water. All right, time to pour the boot tail. We'll do the same thing again. And of course I'm getting really funky combinations of colors in this thing because this is no way to do a multicolor soft bait. Alright, so while that's cooling, I'm going to go ahead and cut out the fishtail one. And I'm making it just a really simple fishtail, so later on when I'm done with this, we can just add the big fat part on the end and turn it into the lug tail and see how that one works too. So to make the lug on the back edge of that fin, I've taken this down and flattened it out on one side, cut a slot on the other side. Now I just need to cut it to length. And it will fit on the fin kind of like that, where you get that blunt trailing edge and kind of a normal fin looking shape in the front. I still got to do some sanding on this, but let's get back and open up that mold. Not too bad. A little bit of flash, but nothing terrible. The boot tail came out perfect. That's what's important. Now I need to cut a slot in the end of the tail so I can fit in that fin. And the fin will mount in there and be glued in with some crazy glue. Alright, I'm getting pretty good at turning these things around now. All I had to do was just scoop out the back because that's the only thing that really changed. So that's what the tail's going to look like. Hopefully I'll get a nice clean casting. We'll see. Alright, now I've got the thing back out of the mold and I want to put on the little lug end on it, but I don't want it to be permanently installed on there because I had another idea for a different kind of tail that I can reuse this style's tail and add one more component to it. So to make the attachment not be permanent, just be a temporary connection, I put a little bit of clay in that slot and I'll just press this in and that'll seal the ends and leave me with what I need for the next one. Alright. Let's get this one open and we got one more to cast. Here you go, it's looking pretty good. That looks pretty good actually. Pretty happy with that. Castings are getting better and better. Very little flash. I can trim that off real easy. The tail came out pretty nice, just a little bit of flash on the end. Yeah, wash this up. We'll move on to the next one. Oh yeah. And here's the next one we're going to do, the lug tail. You can see it's all assembled. I put a little bit of epoxy clear on there just to hopefully have it not stick to the sand so much. So I'll do the same trick. I'm just going to scoop out the tail because that's the only thing that's going to change, and I'll touch up the edges and we should be able to turn this around pretty quickly. Alright, well, that's got it. That's the 5 I said I was going to do. Let me clean this one up and we'll take a closer look at it. Well, that's got the last one that we wanted to do. And I'm going to go ahead and run down to the dock just to take a peek and see what the conditions are. And we'll see if maybe we can get out there and do some testing. Well, as you can see, it's not looking very good, and the weather outlook is going to be like this for the next 3 or 4 days. So we won't be able to test these in the water anytime soon. But I had an idea. I want to do one more tail. In fact, it's going to be a combination of 2 of the tails I just did. And I'm wondering if one of you guys can guess what kind of combination I'm actually doing. Anyway, I'll show you that one when we do the water test. So thanks for watching. I appreciate everyone who comments and offers up suggestions. And if you get anything out of my videos, you should be subscribed. All right, guys, I'll see you on the next video.